In Chapter 1, we are reviewing graphs and functions. First thing to look at is when we're using a graphing calculator, we can change the window. For example, setting our x min and max at -50 to 50, and we could have a scale of 10 in between those. Y min and max at -6 and 6 with a scale of 2 in between those. So when we would see our window, we'd have our -50 over on this side for x, going from 50 here, and because the scale is 10, each unit when we count off would be 10. And then for our y-axis, going from -6 to 6, counting up. So when we see this on a graphing calculator, first of all, we are in the window setting. I can go through and adjust those to the settings that we had just talked about, and then when I look at the graph, we can see these units marked across here. So we're going 10, 20, 30, and so on, going from -50 to 50 for x, -6 to 6 for y. Now we're also looking at distance formula in this section. Remember the distance, we're talking about distance in between point 1 and point 2. So a general formula, if we have point 1 has coordinates x1, y1, and point 2 is at x2, y2. This comes from the Pythagorean theorem. So the distance in between point 1 and point 2, we're going to take the square root of, and we take the difference in our x values and we square that, and the difference in our y values and square that, and we're adding those together. So it's just basically a squared plus b squared is going to be equal to c squared. That's why we take the square root of the whole thing. Now because we're squaring this, the order we plug these in as far as our point 1 and point 2 for our x values and y values doesn't make a difference. We're going to get a positive number either way. So if we have point 1 is at 2, -3, and point 2 is at 10, 3, when we find the distance in between these 2 points, I'm going to find the difference in between my x values. So I'll take 10 minus 2, and I'm going to square that. And then I'll take the difference in between the y values. 3 minus a -3 goes to 3 plus 3, and I'm squaring that. So we end up with 8 squared plus 6 squared. So when we add those together, we have 64 plus 36 gives us 100. So the distance would be the square root of 100, which is equal to 10 for the length of the segment in between those 2 points. For midpoint formula, again we have our point 1 is one end point of our segment, has coordinates of x1, y1. Point 2 has coordinates x2, y2. And the midpoint is directly in between those. It's going to cut it into half, and so we find the x coordinate by taking the average of the x's, find the y coordinate by taking the average of the y's. So if we have a point at -4, -3, another point at 2, 2, to find the midpoint, we're going to take the average of the x's, so -4 plus 2 all divided by 2 for that coordinate, and then the average of the y's, -3 plus 2 divided by 2 for that coordinate. So -4 plus 2 is -2. Divide that by 2, we have a coordinate there then for -1 for the x value, and then -3 plus 2 is -1, so that gives us a -1/2 for the y coordinate. The other part of this first section we're looking at is graphing by hand. So if we have an equation like y equals 2/3 x squared minus 5, and we're graphing by hand, what we want to do is just pick some values for x. And remember, anytime we're talking about a quadratic, we're going to want to pick probably 5 values to give us an idea just where that curve is going to end up. So if we plug in our x values of -2, -1, 0, 1, and 2, and we're squaring each of those, that would be the first thing we would do on each of these. Then we're going to take 2/3 of that. After we square it, we multiply the 2/3, and then we subtract the 5 from that point. So we have our x values that we have picked, and we're solving for y at each of those points. So we end up here with -7/3. This one is -13/3. Here we're at -5. Here we're at -13/3. And here we're at -7/3. So now we have points that we can plot. Here we're at -2, -7/3 would be 1 point. Here's another point at -1, -13/3. Here's our other point at 0, -5. Another point at 1, and then -13/3. And then our last point is at 2, -7/3. Then we go and plot those 5 points, and that will give us our graph.